Caroline of Ansbach, Her Serene Highness Princess of Brandenburg-Ansbach, Her Serene Highness the Electoral Princess of Hanover, Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales, Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain. Caroline was born on the 1st of March 1683 in Ansbach, the Holy Roman Empire, now part of Germany. This is her coat of arms of Ansbach. She died on the 20th of November 1737 at St. James's Palace in London. Buried on the 17th of December 1737 at Westminster Abbey in London. Her husband was King George II of Great Britain. Together they had 9 children: Frederick, Prince of Wales, Anne, Princess Royal, Princess Amelia, Princess Caroline, then sadly a stillborn unnamed son, Prince George William, Prince William, Princess Mary, and Princess Louisa. Caroline's full name was Wilhelmina Charlotte Caroline. She was of the House of Hohenzollern. Her father was John Frederick, Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach. Her mother was Eleanor, Princess of Saxe-Eisenach. Here is Queen Caroline's coat of arms. Her father was the ruler of one of the smallest German states. He died of smallpox at the age of 32 when Caroline was 3 years old. Caroline and her only full sibling, her younger brother, Margrave William Frederick, left Ansbach with their mother, who returned to her native, Eisenach. In 1692, Caroline's widowed mother was pushed into an unhappy marriage with the Elector of Saxony, and she and her 2 children moved to the Saxon court of Dresden. Eleanor was widowed again 2 years later, after her unfaithful husband contracted smallpox from his mistress. Eleanor remained in Saxony for another 2 years until her death in 1696. Caroline soon moved to Luxembourg outside Berlin, where she entered into the care of her guardians, Frederick, Elector of Brandenburg, and his wife, Sophia Charlotte, who had been a friend to Caroline's mother. Frederick and Sophia Charlotte became King and Queen of Prussia in 1701. Caroline was exposed to a lively intellectual environment, quite different from anything she had experienced before. She began her education under Sophia Charlotte's care. Caroline had received little formal education previous. Her handwriting remained poor throughout her life. With her lively mind, Caroline developed into a scholar of considerable ability. She and Sophia Charlotte developed a strong relationship in which Caroline was treated as a surrogate daughter. An intelligent and attractive woman, Caroline was sought after as a bride. She was considered for the hand of Archduke Charles of Austria, who was a candidate for the throne of Spain and later became Holy Roman Emperor. Charles made official overtures to her in 1703, and the match was highly encouraged by Frederick of Prussia. After some consideration, Caroline refused in 1704, as she would not convert to Catholicism. Earlier in the following year, Queen Sophia Charlotte died while on a visit to her native Hanover. Caroline was devastated, writing, "The calamity has overwhelmed me with grief and sickness, and it is only the hope that I may soon follow her that consoles me." In June 1705, Queen Sophia Charlotte's nephew, Prince George Augustus of Hanover, visited the Ansbach court, supposedly incognito, to inspect Caroline, as his father did not want his son to enter into a loveless arranged marriage. He had heard reports of Caroline's incomparable beauty. He immediately took a liking to her, and the British envoy reported that George Augustus would not think of anybody else after her. On the 22nd of August 1705, Caroline arrived in Hanover for her wedding to George Augustus. They were married that evening in the palace chapel. By May of the following year, Caroline was pregnant, and her first child, Prince Frederick, was born on the 20th of January 1707. A few months after his birth in July, Caroline fell seriously ill with smallpox, followed by pneumonia. Her baby was kept away from her, but George Augustus remained at her side devotedly. He caught and survived the infection himself. Over the next 7 years, Caroline had 3 more children, Anne, Amelia and Caroline, all of whom were born in Hanover. George Augustus and Caroline had a successful and loving marriage. Though he continued to keep mistresses, Caroline was well aware of his infidelities, as they were well known, and he told her about them. His 2 best-known mistresses were Harriet Howard, and from 1735, Emily, Countess of Yarmouth. She preferred her husband's mistresses to be ladies in waiting, as that way she believed she could keep a closer eye on them. In June 1714, her father-in-law, the Elector of Hanover, was proclaimed George I of Great Britain. On the accession of King George, Caroline's husband automatically became Duke of Cornwall. Shortly afterwards, he was invested as Prince of Wales, whereupon she became Princess of Wales. Caroline was the first woman to receive the title at the same time as her husband received his. George Augustus and Caroline made a concerted effort to Anglicise by acquiring knowledge of England's language, people, politics and customs. 2 courts developed with strong contrasts. The old king had German courtiers and government ministers, while the Prince and Princess of Wales's court attracted English nobles out of favour with the king and was considerably more popular with the British people. English was Caroline's 3rd language, after German and French. She had a warm, friendly, unprincessy personality, endlessly teasing her servants, laughing, crying, complaining about bores, chatting with intellectuals, whenever she could escape from her boring drawing room duties. 2 years after her arrival in England, Caroline sadly suffered a stillbirth, which her friend blamed on the incompetence of English doctors. But the following year she had another son, Prince George William. At the baptism in November 1717, her husband fell out with his father over the choice of godparents, leading to the couple's placement under house arrest at St. James's Palace prior to their banishment from court. Caroline was originally allowed to stay with her children, but refused, as she believed her place was with her husband. She and her husband moved into Leicester House, while their children remained in the care of the king. Caroline fell sick with worry and fainted during a secret visit to her children made without the king's approval. By January, the king had relented and allowed Caroline unrestricted access. Caroline struck up a friendship with politician Sir Robert Walpole, a former minister in the Whig government, who led a disgruntled faction of the party. Caroline's intellect far outstripped her husband's. She established an extensive library at St. James's Palace. As a young woman, she corresponded with many intellectuals of the day. She helped to popularise the practice of immunisation. At the direction of Caroline, 6 condemned prisoners were offered the chance to undergo this early type of immunisation instead of execution. They all survived, as did 6 orphan children given the same treatment. As a further test, convinced of its medical value, Caroline had her children, Amelia, Caroline and Frederick, inoculated against smallpox in the same manner. Caroline became Queen Consort on the death of her father-in-law in 1727, and she was crowned alongside her husband at Westminster Abbey on the 11th of October that year. She was the first Queen Consort to be crowned since Anne of Denmark in 1603. For the next 10 years, she had immense influence. Caroline had absorbed her liberal opinions and supported freedom of the press and freedom of speech in Parliament, and supported clemency for the Jacobites. They were supporters of the rival Stuart claim to the throne. Over the next few years, she and her husband fought a constant battle against their eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, who had been left behind in Germany when they came to England. He joined the family in 1728, by which time he was an adult, had mistresses and debts, and was fond of gambling and practical jokes. He opposed his father's political beliefs and complained of his lack of influence. The Regency Act of 1728 made Caroline rather than Frederick regent when her husband was in Hanover for 5 months. From May 1732, she was regent for another 4 months, while George was again in Hanover. An investigation into the penal system uncovered widespread abuse, including cruel treatment and conspiracy in the escape of wealthy convicts. Caroline pressed Walpole for reform. This was largely unsuccessful. Caroline's entire life in Britain was spent in the southeast of England, in or around London. As Queen, she continued to surround herself with artists, writers, and intellectuals. She collected jewellery, especially cameos, and acquired important portraits and miniatures, and enjoyed the visual arts. She commissioned works such as terracotta busts of the kings and queens of England, and supervised a more naturalistic design of the royal gardens by William Kent and Charles Bridgman. In 1728, she rediscovered sets of sketches by Leonardo da Vinci and Hans Holbein that had been hidden in drawers since the reign of William III. Caroline's eldest daughter, Anne, married William IV of Orange in 1734 and moved with her husband to the Netherlands. Caroline wrote to her daughter of her indescribable sadness at the parting, and soon felt homesick and travelled back to England when her husband went on campaign. Eventually, her husband and father commanded her to return to Holland. The King and Queen arranged Frederick's marriage in 1736 to Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. Shortly after the wedding, George went to Hanover and Caroline resumed her role as protectress of the realm. The king's absences abroad were leading to unpopularity, and in late 1736, he made plans to return, but his ship was caught in poor weather and it was rumoured that he had died at sea. Caroline was devastated and disgusted by the insensitivity of her son, who hosted a grand dinner while the gale was blowing. The king did make it home safely. In June 1737, Frederick informed his parents that his wife was pregnant and due to give birth in October. In fact, Augusta's due date was earlier, and a peculiar episode followed in July, in which the prince, on discovering that his wife had gone into labour, sneaked her out of Hampton Court Palace in the middle of the night to ensure that the king and queen could not be present at the birth. George and Caroline were horrified. Traditionally, royal births were witnessed by members of the family and senior courtiers to guard against foul play with the child, and Augusta had been forced by her husband to ride in a rattling carriage for an hour and a half while in labour. Caroline was relieved to discover that Augusta had given birth to a, as she wrote, poor ugly little she-mouse, rather than a large fat healthy boy. The circumstances of the birth deepened the estrangement between mother and son. She once remarked after seeing Frederick, "Look, there he goes, the wretch, the villain. I wish the ground would open this moment and sink the monster to the lowest hole in hell." In the final years of her life, Caroline was troubled by gout in her feet, but more seriously, she had suffered an umbilical hernia in the birth of her final child in 1724, and on the 9th of November 1737, she felt an intense pain. Part of her small intestine had poked through the hernia. Over the next few days, she was bled, purged, and operated on with no anaesthetic. But there was an improvement in her condition. The king refused Frederick permission to see his mother, a decision with which she complied. She sent her son a message of forgiveness. Her doctors should have pushed that loop of bowel back inside and hoped that the hole would heal, but instead they made a terrible error. They cut it off. Now Caroline's digestive system was destroyed and she took 10 days to die. During the last day, Caroline more than ever proved her sturdiness of spirit. Although she was in agony, unable to swallow morphine, she kept up her courage. During daily operations, she teased her surgeon, telling him to imagine instead that he was cutting up his cross old wife, whom he hated. And once, when an assistant wig caught fire from a candle burning in a darkened bedchamber, the operation had to stop while the Queen laughed. She asked her husband to remarry after her death, which he rejected, saying he would take only mistresses. She replied, "Ah, mon Dieu, that doesn't prevent it." After years of neglect and infidelities, the king realised he still loved his wife. On the 17th of November, her strangulated bowel burst. She died on the 20th of November, 1737, at St. James's Palace. She was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 17th of December. Frederick was not invited to the funeral. George Frederick Handel composed an anthem for the occasion, "The Ways of Zion," funeral anthem for Queen Caroline. The king arranged for a pair of matching coffins with removable sides, so that when he followed her to the grave 23 years later, they could lie together again for eternity. Memorial to Caroline on the bank of Serpentine, a picturesque lake in London created at her request. Caroline was widely mourned. During her lifetime, she refused to convert. When offered the hand of Archduke Charles, John Gray wrote of Caroline in a letter to a lady in 1714, "The pomp of titles easy faith might shake. She scorned an empire for religion's sake. For this on earth the British crown is given, and an immortal crown decreed in heaven." She was widely seen by both the public and the court as having great influence over her husband. A satirical verse went, "You may strut, dapper George, but 'twill be in vain. We all know 'tis Queen Caroline, not you, that reign. You govern no more than Don Philip of Spain. Then if you would have us fall down and adore you, lock up your fat spouse, as your dad did before you." And this concludes the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please click the like button, give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe for future videos. Thank you.